Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is Concepts Lecture 11 on Eurocentrism in Art Theory. This is an especially interesting and difficult subject because the Eurocentrism of art theory is usually invisible, as I'm going to suggest. It's not at all, Eurocentrism is not at all invisible in disciplines and institutions. It's very much a subject of study in art history, for example, but it is invisible in art theory. If you've been following these first 10 lectures in order, you've probably noticed that the philosophers and theorists that I've been citing are all Western. In fact, it's worse than that. Most of them are European, and many are specifically French and post-war. There's a number of reasons for that. Within the European compass, first of all, the primary reason that art theory is all European is that many of its most basic terms were invented by Greek philosophers and studied throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It's possible to make a listing of these. So the concept of space, that was the subject of Lecture 2. Mimesis, we looked at in Lecture 4 along with representation. Description came up in Lecture 5. Art itself, Lecture 7. The sublime, matter and material, form, and time in Lecture 10. Each one of those has a Latin or Greek root, comes from a Latin or Greek word, and each one is associated with a text or multiple texts written by a Greek or in some cases Roman writer. A second reason that art theory is all European is that many of its most basic values, the values of art and art theory, were defined during the Enlightenment, which is generally speaking the 17th through the 19th centuries. So here's a little list, very general, kind of a risky thing to say because these are such general terms, but more or less the following things come to us from the Enlightenment. The value of empirical investigation and science, something that started in the Enlightenment. Skepticism about dogma and received knowledge, interest in experimentation, a rational attitude to society and open social debate. And by the way, these should be sounding kind of natural to you, like these are things that everybody believes in, like the next one, a belief in constitutional government, and the last one, an investment in self-awareness. They should sound natural because we have imported most of them, and they've become part of general culture in contemporary culture, contemporary art. Again, it's possible to make a listing of these. In this case, just I did this word by word. Experimentation, that is also including science, of course. Rationality, the value that we place on rational conversation and argument. Advanced culture, the value we put on that. Technical and material mastery. Self-awareness, including introspection and those values. And writing. Each one of those could be associated with a writer or writers that are exemplary of them or that are associated with them for different reasons. So there's a list of those. This is really, really general, almost to the point where I'd say it's just, I hesitated putting this slide together because these are such general ideas. But in a way, that's exactly the point because we've internalized the Enlightenment, and with the internationalization of culture and in the art world, it's been internalized internationally. So this is a theme that I'm going to explore later on in this lecture. A third reason, that's happily a little bit more specific than that last list, that all art theory is European, is that the art world and many of the humanities are deeply involved in post-structuralist philosophy, especially from France. So again, it's possible to make a list of post-structuralist concepts that we've seen so far in lectures 1 through 10. So concept of discourse came up in Lecture 3, language and painting, sign and mark, language and visuality, all in Lecture 3, politics, Lecture 6, aesthetic distance, postmodernism, relational aesthetics, time and cinema in Lecture 10. And each one of these can be associated with a principal theorist, and they are all French, and they're all post-war. So this is also a kind of a risky list. I mean, it would be contentious and could be argued with and tinkered with endlessly. It could, first of all, be extended into the hundreds of entries. But I would say that no matter how you adjust this list, French theorists are almost always in the majority, if not principal references for all the leading concepts that underwrite post-structuralist art theory. Some of the ones that that come up in later lectures by name are Lacan, Foucault, and Barthes in lectures 18, 19, and 20. So these are all very reflective people, of course, and that makes it especially strange that there's such a universal acceptance that post-war art theory is the best way of describing art. If you think about it, that's quite strangely counterintuitive. So there's an interesting disconnect in the art world. On the one hand, art is increasingly diverse and represents a growing number of subject positions and ethnicities around the world. On the other hand, writing about art is strongly dependent on European concepts and virtually entirely dependent on post-war French philosophers, which means that French post-structural concepts are applied to the art of all cultures, past and present. That's where it becomes strongly counterintuitive and seems clear that it's a problem that needs to be thought through. But regarding Eurocentrism, it means, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, a focus on Europe to the exclusion of the rest of the world. It's a misleading term, in part because it's vague. It doesn't name which parts of Europe, and it doesn't say which parts, periods in European history. So Eurocentrism, it's too large for its target. It could be made more exact, but Eurocentrism is the word that's used. But it's also misleading because it implies people intentionally use European theories. This may often be true in politics, but the majority of artists and writers who use European theories don't notice their biases. This unconscious privileging is described by Dipesh Chakrabarty, who's an Indian-born philosopher who lives and works in the US, in this book, Provincializing Europe. It may seem that it's possible to make people aware of the fact that the concepts they're applying to art come mainly from the European Enlightenment, so that in that way we could all become more reflective and find ways to avoid such concepts entirely. In other words, this would seem to be a problem of awareness. But Chakrabarty's book shows why this is not as simple as it seems. Cultural concepts like democracy and science are privileged because they appear to be the product of reasoning alone and open social discussion. They appear to be communal, consensual, and natural. But those ideas, like the other ones I listed, are themselves from the Enlightenment. Some of the principal meanings of reason, argument, and philosophy come from the 18th century Enlightenment understanding of Greek philosophy. So it can be nearly impossible to step outside of European cultural values if they're understood in this way, because the way of framing the problem of stepping outside of Europe, of provincializing Europe, the way of framing that problem, of arguing against European values, and of formulating alternative positions, all of those require, follow, and rehearse Enlightenment values. Post-colonial and decolonial theory are themselves implicated, therefore, in the European philosophies that they want to minimize or provincialize. That's the problem that concerns Chakrabarty in this book. Eurocentrism I'm going to return to in history lecture 23, where it applies to the history of art itself. But back to Chakrabarty and Eurocentrism in art theory. Art theory has this additional obstacle that its most basic terms like space, time, form, material are all Western and specifically European. So when new or unfamiliar words are introduced, they have to be defined in terms of those words. And in this lecture, I'm going to consider a couple of examples of that. Before I turn to those, though, there is also the problem of the denigration or marginalization of other systems of philosophic thought. So in addition to the fact that the most foundational terms in art theory are European, there is this problem that since the early 19th century, Western philosophers have experienced non-Western writing on art as something other than philosophy. Often it's described as thought, which can subtly lower its status in relation to systematic European philosophy. That in the photograph there's another French philosopher, Alain Badiou, who has described Chinese writing in these terms as thought. This is a difficult problem because the word thought in the French post-structuralist tradition is also a way of pointing to the most basic ways that people make sense. But ever since Hegel, there has been the idea that Europe has philosophy, which means metaphysics, and the rest of the world just has thought. This way of describing other philosophic traditions extends even to writers who have specialized in non-Western cultures, like François Jullien, who writes on Chinese culture. He has also described Chinese writing that he studied extensively as thought in tacit opposition to Western philosophy. So before I go on to suggest a couple of non-European terms for art, I just want to underscore the central insight, as I take it, of Chakrabarty's book, and that is, if you wish to provincialize Europe, your desire to do that and the tools that you have to do it are going to be taken themselves from the apparently natural reservoir of human reason and open discussion and debate, which are actually historically from the Enlightenment, from the European Enlightenment. So you're trying to take the tools of your freedom from the place from which you're trying to escape. So I want to end with just some suggestions of non-European terms for art. For most of these lectures, I've chosen concepts and problems that are important in the art world in general. In this case, however, there's so few non-European words used to describe art that it's necessary, I think, to introduce a few. The three terms I'm going to introduce here can't be easily translated back into Greek, Latin, English, French, or other European languages, and for that reason, they're especially promising as new words to describe art, quote-unquote new. So if any of these words seem to fit your practice, you might want to experiment using them instead of words like space and time and other words. So here's a really interesting word in Chinese, xiang. This word, xiang, is half of a word for image, xing xiang. By itself, xiang means appearance. Xing means form or shape. So an image gives form or shape to appearance. Xiang names what an image carries. There's a 12th century Chinese writer, Zheng Chao, who uses the word xiang when he writes about images. So there's a very good text on this, written in English by this scholar, Sihan. Xiang combines what appears in a picture and the person to whom it appears. So there isn't an English word that does both of those things. It's a mixture of the Western terms viewer and representation. So here's what Sihan writes. Quote, there are two words in Chinese for what is called image in Western languages. One is tu, which means graphical images, and the other is xiang, which refers to all kinds of imagery and has been used for phenomenon, appearance, likeness, imitation, resemblance, figure, symbol, metaphor, imaginary, and imagination. So this is a word that seems to me to be very promising if we're going to hope to change the Eurocentrism of art theory by trying words from other languages. You wouldn't want to find words that translate too easily back into any word that exists now, because the world of art theory is still very much anchored on words that come from Greek and Latin roots, so you wouldn't want to just have a synonym for them. So this is a very interesting word for that reason. If you would like a word that equates consciousness with painting, that can mean both consciousness and painting, in the Pali language, the word chitta would be an interesting choice. So in Pali, painting or depicting is pronounced and spelled the same as the word for mind or consciousness. In 1931, the philosopher and historian Ananda Coomaraswamy wrote a commentary on a 5th century after the Common Era text called the Athasalini, which contains a description of this word chitta. And there's more on Coomaraswamy if you're interested in lecture 15 of the history series. In that 5th century text, written by Buddhaghosa, there is this explanation of thinking using the word chitta, quote, because of its capacity to produce various effects in action, the mind, chitta, is itself depicting, chitta. Indeed, it is even more various and pictorial, that's a different word, than painting, chitta. If Western writers use this word, they would be able to express the way that pictures sometimes are thought. They seem to be thinking, which is a theme that I introduced in lecture 3. And if this word had been common, if it ever becomes common in the art world, it should go in presentations like lecture 3, because it would be a very interesting contribution to have a single concept for the artwork and the thought that seems to be in it. And last, here's an example from Farsi, the language spoken in Iran, and Arabic. According to an Iranian writer and poet, Kadkani, there's an Arabic word for image, khayal, which he says meant scarecrow because the image is an object that has no truth to it. It isn't alive, and yet it still exists. In Farsi, the cognate word khyal also means dream, a sweet dream or a daydream. And associated meanings there would be fiction and metaphor. This would be a fabulous word to use to describe artwork if to you artworks, they seem like dreams, or if you want to emphasize in the Arabic version the idea of something that has no truth in it, or that's empty, it's like a scarecrow. They're both really interesting possibilities. It's interesting to use words from outside of the European tradition. If you're an artist, there's no limit to what you can use in your artist statements and critiques. But this kind of experiment hasn't happened in professional writing. And that's not because of a quote-unquote Eurocentric prejudice. Most historians and critics are very engaged with issues of international art and translation. It's because these words still need European words to define them, which is what I just did on those screens. And then they become yet more examples of European and usually French art theory. I think the main thing to bear in mind here is that despite all of our efforts at inclusion and diversity and the inclusion of different kinds of interpretive methodologies and the inclusion, of course, of all different artists in art history, all the topics that I'm going to get to in the history lectures, despite all of that, there's an amazing obliviousness to the fact that when we interpret art from any culture, when we theorize about art from any time or place, we tend to use French post-structuralist theory as if it was transcultural. And French post-structuralism is one of the main places from which people have learned that there is no such thing as a trans-historical truth. And yet, those same people who read those authors use them to interpret any art.